I will now call on Saleh Waziruddin to present.
Hi, thanks, Mayor and Council. I'm Saleh Waziruddin, a resident of St. Catharines. The problem with the resolution tonight, at least as it was in the original draft, is that it calls for Canada to give military support until a solution Ukraine wants, which is impossible because there's no military solution to this conflict. Except for rhetoric, most are saying it'll be a long war and there's no quick victory for either side in sight. The only realistic solution is a negotiated settlement, which means by definition it won't satisfy everything either side wants, but it's the only way to end the conflict. But the problem is bigger than just ending a long period of senseless slaughter between two countries. The conflict in Ukraine is not just about defending Ukraine. It's drawing most of the world into it, with NATO countries sending all the weapons they can spare and Iran supplying drones to Russia. The CIA said recently China is considering sending weapons to Russia. This conflict is not going to be contained any more than any world war has been. It's going to quickly suck everyone in. This is not about defending Ukraine any more than World War I was about defending Serbia or avenging Archduke Ferdinand's assassination. We have to look at the full picture of what a military escalation, which this resolution is urging, will do. World War II had 11 times the deaths in World War I, and World War III is going to be even worse. And this is happening fast. Japan has abandoned even the pretense of pacifism in its constitution and signed a military alliance with the UK, indirectly with NATO. U.S. Marines are deliberately going into China's missile umbrella. The U.S. has said any attack in space will be considered an attack on its allies. When I was a child, there was an anti-war song about 99 red balloons starting World War III. It's only taken one red balloon, maybe not the color red, to get the shooting started. When I spoke at Regional Council last year against escalation, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, founded by Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer, among others, said we were at 100 seconds to doomsday. Now they're saying we're at 90 seconds. Professor Nouriel Roubini, who was on the White House Council of Economic Advisors under Clinton, said World War III has already started because it's broader than just Russia and Ukraine. Across, on the other side of the political spectrum, war hawk John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, has also said we're already in a world war. But his conclusion is the opposite of mine. He says, even though we're in a world war, what difference does it make? Let's go all in. On the peace side, we're saying that's very dangerous for the whole world. We should be putting out the fire engulfing the world, not inflaming it. The debate right now is whether to fully escalate further into World War III, saying Ukraine will lose if we don't, even if it goes on for years, or to choose peace and a negotiated end to the conflict. Peace through a negotiated settlement is not only realistic, and the groundwork's already been going on. Ukraine and Russia have already reached prisoner exchange agreements. Early on in the conflict, a former Israeli prime minister, acting as a go-between, said a peace deal was close at hand, but pressure from the West saying the war would be over quickly with a military escalation scuttled it. Well, the conflict's still going on a year later. President Zelensky has recently said he's interested in China's proposal for peace. We have to let that option go forward. But a negotiated settlement is not going to be to the satisfaction of either side. So this resolution calling for an end to the war in a way agreeable to one side really means a military solution. And again, that's not realistic. Only after this rapidly escalating war is brought to a negotiated end can further political settlements be reached peacefully. After decades of senseless killing in Ireland, they came to an agreement that didn't completely satisfy either side, but opened the door so that a final settlement would be arrived at peacefully and democratically, not through death and destruction. We who are calling for a realistic, peaceful solution as an alternative to a long world war are not alone. A poll that came out Friday for Post Media by Leisure says only a third of Canadians support military escalation, defining the poll as sending more military equipment or more Canadian troops training Ukrainians. There's also growing support in Canada for a negotiated peace. The resolution mentions the duty to stand for peace, freedom, and democracy. War for freedom and democracy, we've heard that one before 20 years ago, and that was one of the arguments used to invade Iraq. Look at how awful that turned out. Freedom and democracy can't be spread through war. We're hearing the same thinking again, as if we haven't learned. And peace does not mean war. That's doublespeak, and if you don't agree, you have to take that one up with George Orwell. Also, by the way, the city, as mentioned already in this meeting, has declared a climate emergency. Militaries are among the biggest polluters and have the biggest carbon footprints. You can't have it both ways. Instead, we should be urging the Canadian government to support a peaceful settlement. To quote a line from the movie Dr. Strangelove, let's face it, we don't want to start a nuclear war unless we really have to, do we? This city council needs to urge the government for a negotiated peace, not escalating a global conflict, quickly getting out of control. Thank you.
I'll call on Tamara Lorincz to present. Ms. Lorincz.
Good evening. I'm a PhD candidate at the Balsillie School of International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. I have a master's in international politics and security studies from the University of Bradford in the UK and a law degree from Dalhousie University. I worked as a commercial intern for the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade at the Canadian Embassy in Norway and as a senior researcher for the International Peace Bureau in Switzerland. I'm also a longtime member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which have ECOSOC consultative status at the United Nations and which are members of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. I am not a member of any political party. My views are informed by deep knowledge of Canadian foreign and defense policies, extensive research on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the conflict in Ukraine, and a commitment to peace, disarmament, and international law. The war in Ukraine must be understood in the broader context of NATO. In 1999, NATO, including Canada, illegally bombed the former Yugoslavia, causing its disastrous breakup. In 2001, NATO, including Canada, began a deadly and destructive 20-year war in Afghanistan. And in 2011, Canada led the NATO bombing of Libya that destroyed civilian infrastructure, toppled the government, and caused turmoil in the country that persists to this day. NATO's expansion to Russia's border in Eastern Europe and its training and arming of Ukrainian security forces are major contributors to the current conflict. When the Canadian government claims that Canada is helping Ukraine protect its democracy, this should raise alarm bells. Canada's foreign policy is not truly motivated by democracy. We must remember that in 2004, Canada orchestrated with the United States and France the coup against the democratically elected government of Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti. Haiti continues to be in extreme chaos and poverty 2 decades later. In 2019, Canada with the United States attempted to overthrow the democratically elected government of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela that thankfully did not succeed. Venezuela was able to protect its democracy from this illegal Western interference. Canada has subverted democracy in Haiti, Venezuela, Libya, and in Ukraine. In 2014, Canada and the United States supported the violent protests in Kyiv that ousted the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych. The U.S. supported interim President Alexander Ternachov, launched discriminatory measures and violent operations against the Russian-speaking minorities in eastern Donbass region that led to the civil war that has been raging for 9 years. Since then, Canada has exacerbated the conflict by undermining the Minsk agreements, by the training and arming of violent Ukrainian security forces who have injured and killed the Russian-speaking people in the east. This is what has contributed to the broader war with Russia. Over the past year, Canada made things worse by refusing diplomacy and by sending over $1 billion of weapons to Ukraine: sniper rifles, machine guns, howitzer artillery guns, rocket launchers, hand grenades, ammunition, armored vehicles, surface-to-air missile systems, and Leopard tanks. Weapons don't bring democracy and peace. I want to end by saying that last November, I was in Warsaw, Poland, where I met with a group of Ukrainian refugees. They were men from both sides of the contact line in Ukraine, from the West and the East. They left the country because they don't want to fight each other. They want to work. They said to me, "We are brothers and we want the war to end." The best way to support these Ukrainians is to stand for peace. I want to appeal to the City Council to amend the motion to state, quote, "Urge the Government of Canada to support Ukraine by stopping the weapons and the war and instead sending diplomats for a negotiated peace." Finally, I want to bring to your attention the important work of Dr. Ivan Kachanovsky, a Ukrainian-Canadian professor of political science at the University of Ottawa. He has done authoritative research on Canada's nefarious involvement in the Maidan protests and the coup in Ukraine that has led to this war, and the 2019 book by Dr. Stephen Cohen, War with Russia, ? From Putin and Ukraine to Trump and Russiagate. Dr. Cohen was the foremost expert on U.S.-Russia relations and warned that what NATO and the United States were doing in Ukraine was going to lead to this dangerous war with Russia that risks a nuclear escalation. He was right. Now we need to stop it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lawrence. Are there any questions of the presenter? Councillor Miller.
Yeah, thanks, Tamara, for sharing your insight and expertise. Obviously, none of us are really expert in this field. Do you have a sense a lot of this motion is about supporting Ukrainian Canadians and specifically those who live in St. Catharines. Do you have a sense, is there a consensus of what Ukrainian Canadians are looking for in terms of Canada's involvement or, you know, the end game of the result of the invasion of Ukraine?
Councillor Miller, is it? I would like to let you know that the next speaker, Glenn Michalchuk, is the head of the Association of Ukrainian Canadian, the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, and he is going to be speaking after me, so he will be able to address that question, but very well. But I do want to say that that there is a big Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, and the Ukrainian Canadian Congress that we hear that is presenting at this meeting and that we hear all the time in the media receives funding from the federal government, is close to the federal government, is always in the media, and the other voices in the Ukrainian Canadian community that are advocating for peace, that are opposed to the continued sending of weapons to Ukraine, that want a negotiated resolution, do not have that access to the government, aren't getting that kind of funding, don't have that access to the media. And the AUUC that's going to be presenting next, is an advocate for peace. We want an end to this war because we know that there are people being injured and killed on both sides, civilians and soldiers. And this is why, for us, it's so important that Canada change course on its foreign policy and change course on what it's been doing in Ukraine for the past decade, and instead stop the sending of weapons and be an honest broker, for peace and negotiations in this horrible conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, and I will wait for the next speaker and certainly ask him the same question. Thanks.
None, we'll call on Glenn Michalchuk to present.
Thank you. Let me just briefly explain who I represent. I am the national president of the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians. Our national office is located here in Winnipeg and is adjacent to the Ukrainian Labor Temple, which is a national historic site. The AUUC is the oldest mass secular organization of Ukrainians who came to Canada to start a new life. It has existed for 100 years and throughout has represented the strivings of Ukrainian Canadians, both settled and newcomers. The first of the labor temples to be built as part of our organization was the Labor Temple in Welland. I would like to thank Mayor and Council for the opportunity to speak tonight on this important issue. Ending the war in Ukraine is of paramount importance. The conflict threatens peace in Europe. Escalation of the conflict threatens world peace and security. Canadians have been impacted by the conflict. Ukraine has been devastated by the conflict. Millions have fled the country. Thousands have died or been injured. The country's infrastructure and environment have been damaged, and it will take billions of dollars to repair this. This war, its destruction, and the collateral damage to the world economy and supply of food could have been averted. Before the outbreak of this war, the AUUC called for diplomacy and negotiations for peace. Our position was not unique to the AUUC. It was widespread sentiment amongst Canadians. It was the position of the people in Ukraine. Once the war broke out, we called for its resolution through diplomacy and peace negotiations. Again, this was not a position unique to our organization. A framework for peace existed in the Minsk agreements, signed by Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France, and ratified by the UN Security Council. We have since learned that averting this war was not in the cards. On February 24th, war broke out, much larger than the civil war that waged in eastern Ukraine since 2014. There was a possibility to stop it. We know the peace talks of April 2022 between Russia and Ukraine were scuttled. We have now had 10 months of war that was preventable. The resolution before Council tonight is not a resolution which will bring the conflict any closer to being resolved. Weapons have fueled this conflict. The desire to maintain the flow of weapons has escalated the conflict. In the resolution before you, it specifically calls for continued military assistance. Canada would do better to call for resolution of the conflict by supporting the majority of nations who want the conflict to end. Instead of fueling the war, Canada should support the diplomatic initiatives to bring the warring parties to agree to a ceasefire, negotiations for settlement of the issues that underlie this war, and the achievement of a peace agreement. Peace and diplomacy is distinctly lacking in the Canadian government actions in response to this war. Increasing numbers of Canadians believe this is what needs to be done. It would be of significance if the St. Catharines City Council did likewise, supporting peace initiatives instead of military initiatives as the means to end this war. If we are to avert more destruction to Ukraine and the danger of this war escalating to the possibility of conflict between NATO and Russia, then we must all support the initiatives that are underway to end the conflict. Internationally, these initiatives are led by Turkey, Brazil, India, China, South Africa, and of course, the United Nations. We know that the president of Ukraine has responded positively to the China initiative released on Friday. We know that Russia has also indicated its willingness to enter peace negotiations. The world may be at a moment like that in April of last year when there was a real possibility to end the war. This moment should not be lost, but I fear that may be the case. I have watched events in Ukraine very closely, both before and after the Russian invasion of February 24th. The people of Ukraine wanted peace after 8 years of civil war. President Zelensky was elected on a platform of peace, but was prevented by opposition forces in Ukraine which did not want peace. At this critical moment, we hear the call for escalation through more weapons. Canada can play a critical role in changing what is happening, but it needs to change what it is doing. Canada must emphasize the need to bring peace to Ukraine and act accordingly. The strategy of more weapons to support more war has been a failure. In conclusion, I urge councillors to take a stand which will push forward ending this war and securing peace. I've spoken many times on this. I have said that the war could have been averted but was not, and once it started, could be stopped. The policy of weapons and war has been disastrous. I thank you for your time.
All right, Councillor Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to, I guess, the presenter. To make it clear, we certainly all want peace in this conflict. And I guess the concern here is the part in the motion that provides military support during this time. I guess my question would be, without the military support, how would Ukraine be able to defend themselves without having that support?
Well, I take you back to what I said in my remarks. In April 2022, there was a definite peace plan on the table between Russia and Ukraine. Once that was scuttled, it's this never-ending cycle of weapons and war and weapons and war. But there's significant diplomatic initiatives underway. And the question is, if those initiatives are going to be successful, then a country like Canada, if it steps up and assists those initiatives, can make that change.
Thank you for that.
Otherwise, you're locked into an endless cycle of more weapons, more war. And I think, as been said by the first speaker, Saleh, that there's no guarantee that this is going to bring any different outcome. But if there's a concerted effort to ask for peace and negotiations by world powers and middle powers such as Canada, that is certainly going to change the narrative of what's going on.
Thank you, Mr. Michalchuk. And I'll also acknowledge you for your work that you've been doing out in Winnipeg with the Walk for Peace and calling on peace of both nations. So thank you.
All right, are there any other questions? Councillor Miller.
Yeah, thank you. I guess similar question to what I asked, and I don't expect you to represent all Ukrainian Canadians, but do you have a feeling that there's a consensus or a majority of what Ukrainian Canadians want in order to resolve this conflict, or how this conflict could be resolved in this, and something that we could meaningfully support or advocate for?
I think it's very hard for anyone to say they know what a consensus of what all Ukrainian Canadians think about the question. But like I said in my remarks, I've been following this war very closely before and since the war broke out. Here's what I understand about what Canadians of Ukrainian descent, whether they're second or third generation. I'm third generation myself, or even those who are newcomers. I do think that I can say with some confidence that Ukrainians want peace. Now, whether I can say that's a majority or not, I haven't been able to poll Ukrainians to that extent. Why do I say that? Because when the war first broke out, there were large rallies of Ukrainian Canadians. And I would go to those rallies and I would listen to the news reports, because the news people interviewed participants there. And it was very interesting when you listen to the news reports or when you talk to people. The ordinary people what was their concern? Their concern was what is happening to their family back home. What is happening? Will the war get bigger? I mean, I'm talking about in the first weeks of the war. And then when you heard, say, representatives who were there from the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, they presented the Ukrainian Canadian Congress position on the war. And at the beginning of the war, it was they would advocate for no-fly zones, they would advocate for more weapons, and so on. So that's one thing that I've noticed, is there's this kind of break between what ordinary people say and what maybe some organizations that have an agenda around the war to present. I do know, and I have been in touch with ordinary Ukrainians of relatively newcomers to Canada, and they have come from various parts, such as Eastern Ukraine. We have to remember that Eastern Ukraine is a Ukrainian population that has been the target of 8 years of civil war. So I do think that Ukrainians desire peace. As I said, Zelensky was elected on a platform of peace, amongst other things of his platform, which was dealing with corruption and so on in Ukraine. So I think there is a genuine sentiment for peace amongst Ukrainian Canadians and amongst the people of Ukraine and people of Ukraine.
All right. Thank you, Councillor Williamson, followed by Councillor Kushner.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through to the presenter. I am no war hawk, but Vladimir Putin is the aggressor in this situation, and he really doesn't seem to be willing to respond to diplomacy or overtures of peace. And we've seen this in history. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies and show them that you're going to be willing to apply some force. How would you? And Churchill said it's better to jaw than it is to war. But when time came, he was willing to take on the aggressors. How would you respond to the fact that Vladimir Putin is not necessarily a rational decision maker and may not respond to overtures of peace in a diplomatic way? Thank you.
Well, we know that's not even borne out by the facts, what you say. I mean, there was negotiations between Ukraine and Russia for a peace deal in April 2022. You may not choose to believe the reports that have come from people who were actually part of those negotiations, including, I think it was the former president of Israel, who documented how that deal was broken apart by the actions of the United States and the United Kingdom. There was an actual peace deal on the table. There was the Minsk agreements on the table. before the war broke out. So there's no evidence to suggest that peace was not possible in Ukraine, or that Russia was interested in anything other than resolution of, first of all, the civil war in Ukraine through the Minsk agreements, and now this war. I mean, you have major powers such as China and India, who also have contact with Russia and its leadership. And they believe that a peace agreement can be reached.
All right, Councillor Kushner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Now, everyone wants peace. I'm of Ukrainian descent, and the Ukrainians I talk to certainly want peace. They don't want war. My parents came to this country because of war in the Ukraine, and they advocated for peace. But at the same time, you have to step up to a bully. Now, if you want to advocate for peace, why are you not advocating for the Russians to pull out of Ukraine? That would be a good step for proper negotiations, because you can't negotiate with somebody who's invaded your country and is slaughtering the people, slaughtering the cultural icons, and slaughtering the infrastructure. It's not even. And if you want to negotiate, you have to have two even parties. And right now, there are not two even parties. One is being slaughtered by an invader. And therefore, I would suggest that you propose to the Russians that they withdraw from the country, and if they did, I'm sure there would be a negotiated peace very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other questions? All right.
I could respond to that. I could respond to that if I might.
No, that's okay. We'll move on to I'm going to remind all of our presenters who are all coming through Zoom, you do have 5 minutes to speak. Okay, so I will ask you to stick to the 5-minute time limit.